Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to be taking a nuanced look at coercion, manipulation and brainwashing. Some people aren't going to like this video, so if you're easily offended, don't watch this video, or if you do, please feel free to leave your comments because I'm always interested to hear what other people have to say. Pardon me. I feel that this video is needed or necessary because I'm seeing the term manipulation, coercion, brainwashing get thrown around a lot, especially because of the Tate saga, and I've got quite a controversial view which isn't unfounded because the law actually to some extent does adopt this view, at least in England they do. Coercion, manipulation and brainwashing to some extent is an inevitable part of life. Those words are quite controversial words because they're quite emotive and they have negative connotations. So most people struggle to get their head around this. So if you use manipulation, for example, and then you replace it with gently guiding someone into making the right choice, essentially they mean the same thing in practice, but when you discuss it with someone and you use the word manipulation instead of gently guiding someone, there's a very different connotation, and that's not to be unexpected. It's completely reasonable for people to have different emotional reactions to different words. But I'm going to be using the buzzwords like manipulation, coercion and brainwashing because I feel that it's important to understand those words and get a more true and more developed understanding of what those things are. Manipulation. For the purposes of this video and this discussion, I'm going to be defining manipulation as using someone's emotions to increase the likelihood that they will do something. And that's quite a broad definition, and it's a spectrum. So what manipulation can be is it can be anything from asking someone to do something when they're in a good mood, to lying to somebody and making someone angry so that they will take your side in an argument. There's quite a big spectrum there, so I'd like you to apply proportionality to this, but I'm going to explain it in the most proportionate and balanced way I can. So I would suggest that manipulation is a part of everyday life. Manipulation only becomes an issue when it's disproportionate and unreasonable. So I'll give some examples of manipulation in day-to-day life. A teacher, when she's teaching kids, will incentivize them and structure their lessons so it's much easier for the children to get through it by taking advantage of knowledge that the children may not necessarily possess into deciding when they do the hard parts of the school day and when they do the easy parts of the school day. So I know this isn't the best example to use for adults, but lots of companies, I think Google is quite a good example, put measures in place to keep their employees happy at work so that they'll spend more time working. This is a manipulation by my definition. However, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people could argue it's a bad thing. Some people could argue it's a good thing. However, there are a lot of very successful companies that put measures in place so their employees are more satisfied and enjoy work, and they get more out of them. This, I think most right-thinking people would argue, is not a negative form of manipulation. And that's fair enough. I may or may not agree with you. But what I'm trying to get at here is manipulation takes place in day-to-day life. Manipulation can be a negative thing, but it can also be a good thing. And it's essential for getting on with people. For example, nudge units in Pakistan encouraged people hand washing by making the hand wash smell good and using lots of clever marketing. So that's an example of the population at large being manipulated into washing their hands. For a full case study on that, there's a book called Atomic Habits, which I'd recommend. But manipulating people into doing positive activities generally isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it's very common. And to some extent, I think people do this without thinking about it. So you know that it's not a good time to ask your parents to do something when they've just got in through the door, or ask your partner to do something when they've just got in through the door. It's probably best to ask them to do something they don't want to do after you've done something nice for them, like cook them dinner or something. And that's you emotionally manipulating your partner or parents to get a good thing out of them that they may not necessarily want to do. And that is just a normal part of relationships. I think manipulation becomes an issue when people are manipulating others to do things that are actively against their interests. And that's quite a high bar. And to some extent, people in day-to-day life do manipulate people into doing something that is against their interests. But there's a proportionality element to this type of manipulation. So what I'd say is, if you're manipulating your friend into inviting you to their party or having a party, that's probably not as bad as manipulating someone into committing a criminal offence, which does happen. So normally someone who's being manipulated into doing a criminal offence is normally extremely vulnerable, whether they've got a drug problem or something like that, or they're extremely emotionally vulnerable. So what normally happens in that case, when someone who is extremely emotionally vulnerable is being manipulated into doing a crime, the person who is the orchestrator of the crime will normally guide someone and make them feel good when the person who's got the emotional issues is doing something for that person. This can be conscious and unconscious, by the way. And normally, the emotionally vulnerable person will pick up on subtle hints put out by the orchestrator of the crime, and the emotionally vulnerable person will commit the crime on their behalf or for their benefit. It's important to discuss that this isn't always a conscious decision by a person, because if someone's trying to orchestrate someone into doing a crime, normally that is conscious, but this can happen when someone is trying to impress someone else. Peer pressure is a brilliant example of this. So lots of young kids will do very stupid things as children to try and impress their mates, and, as I say, be held in higher regard, which is a form of emotional manipulation. But a lot of time peer pressure isn't conscious. Sometimes it is, and it's awful when it is. But it's quite interesting to watch children and think back to when I was a child and a young teenager, some of the stupid things I'd do without people asking me to do them, because I wanted the clout, I wanted the status of doing it. And it's quite interesting because a lot of people socially will not blame someone who has been emotionally manipulated, or not ascribe any blame to them, which isn't necessarily the best thing in the world, because lots of people who are emotionally manipulated open themselves up at the very least to being manipulated in that way. And the law of duress is quite interesting here, because in English criminal law you have a defence of duress, which means if you're forced into doing something, you're violently coerced into doing it, and the threats must match the crime. So someone can't threaten to leak your nudes, but they won't do it if you rob a bank for them. So if someone did that and threatened to leak your nudes and you robbed a bank for them, that wouldn't be a sufficient duress for you to get off the crime of robbing a bank. And I think it's the same with manipulation. Lots of people who get emotionally manipulated into things normally would be willing to do it anyway, or the idea of doing it, whatever they end up doing for someone, isn't that alien to them. They were possibly going to do it anyway. But I think that's quite difficult to know for certain, but I definitely think this should be considered when thinking about manipulation as a whole, because manipulation at the end of the day is someone taking advantage of the insecurities and the emotions of other people. So it's not coercion in the sense that if someone chooses not to act on emotional manipulation, normally there won't be any negative repercussions for them. And manipulation and emotional manipulation is used a lot in advertising and sales. For example, a coffee shop that I went to has this hot blonde girl who's really lovely and talkative, and the place is packed all the time. What's happening there is this girl who's lovely, hot, blonde and very talkative appeals to everybody, mostly men, and the clientele, the buyers of the coffee, are being emotionally manipulated to buy coffee there instead of anywhere else. And this place is more expensive as well, I should add. So it's important and interesting to note that emotional manipulation is everywhere. And it's quite difficult to, and quite foolish, I think, to prescribe manipulation as a bad thing. Whereas what I'd argue is negative manipulation, being manipulation that is directly in opposition to the person who's being manipulated's interests, is a bad thing when it's unreasonable and out of all proportionality. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. Brainwashing. Brainwashing as a term gets used a lot. Brainwashing is quite misunderstood by the public. For example, when you talk to someone about brainwashing, the image they'll normally have in their head is someone being tied to a chair and made to watch videos of whatever they're being brainwashed to think. So normally that kind of brainwashing isn't effective, if at all. There is something to be said for repetition-based brainwashing, which I discuss in my public speaking in locals, but I don't call it brainwashing. But essentially, the more you repeat something, the more comfortable a person becomes with the idea. The only caveat to that is if they know that you're repeating it to try and persuade them, they're not necessarily going to be as amenable to it because they'll have psychological defences up. Whereas if you just repeat something and repeat an idea in a subtle way, normally that will have the effect of persuading someone. And repetition can be a very good way of persuading people. But on to brainwashing, I'm going to use the example of religious cults, but to explain how this works. Essentially with brainwashing, what you want to do is you want the person to subscribe to a set of beliefs. So what you need to do is you need to get the person, the individual, to associate positive emotions with those beliefs. So what a lot of religious cults do is they will have open evenings for their core demographic, which for religious cults is normally divorced women and young lonely men who are at university or whatever. And what will happen, we'll take the case of young men, because a lot of religious cults separate the two demographics. What they'll do is they'll have the young men come to a sort of sports-based activity or games night, and there'll be lots of young, attractive, kind women, and they'll subtly talk about their ideas. And what will happen is if you're lonely and you start going to activities evenings with a religious cult, normally what will happen is when you go to those activities meetings, you'll be on a high, you'll feel really good, and you'll associate that feeling with the ideas. So what brainwashing is necessarily is you're making someone feel positive emotions with ideas you want them to adopt, and you're making someone feel negative emotions or encouraging people to feel negative emotions and with activities and ideas you don't want them to adopt. I mean, to a certain extent, brainwashing is used pretty much everywhere. I mean, I know it's slightly different in propaganda, but Edward Bernays says, I can't remember which book of his it's by, but he says what is propaganda is determined by the beholder. And the same is true of brainwashing, actually, because what someone claims is brainwashing to another will be education. And I think it's very difficult to use the term brainwashing as a blanket term. I really don't think it should be used, to be honest, because all brainwashing is effective persuasion tactics. I'm going to move on to coercion in a minute. And normally religious cults, after they've, for lack of a better term, brainwashed someone, the coercion will start. So normally what happens in a religious cult is you normally, after a period of time, will give your assets to the cult so that you can't leave, or leaving the religious cult is extremely difficult. But normally by then most people wouldn't anyway, because they associate so many negative emotions with the outside world and associate positive emotions with the cult. But most religious cults have to have that kind of coercion in there, because coercion, especially when it isn't seen and isn't obvious, is quite effective, because most people, especially if they're being brainwashed as well, I don't like that term but I'm going to use it, will ignore the coercion because they're happy anyway. And this is quite an interesting thing, because you can't brainwash someone or you can't manipulate someone into doing something unless they want to feel a certain way, and to some extent they're willing to be brainwashed. I mean, if you go into a session and get someone to try and brainwash you and pretend that you're full of it, or get you to change your mind, that's probably not going to work if you know it's going on and you're consciously aware of it, because you can put up defences, you'll begin to notice the tactics they use. Whereas if you're not going for, or not going expecting to have new ideas or practices shown to you or expected of you, it's quite effective when that happens and you're feeling good at the time. Coercion. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to define coercion as threatening someone with violence or threatening someone with economic harm. So, to some extent, coercion goes on in day-to-day life. Your relationship with the state is coercive. If you don't pay your taxes, eventually the state's going to use violence to put you in prison. And to some extent, coercion does also take place in the corporate world or the world of work. Because most people, with the exception of very few, are in need of money. They have to work. So what would happen, and what happens for most people, is work is actually the only way they eat or can survive. So especially for people who are more low income, such as people who work for fast food restaurants, aren't really free to not work. So they have to work because essentially, in an indirect way, a company provides them with food in the form of money and the essentials they need. So when you work for a fast food restaurant, if you don't turn up on time and you don't do what you're meant to do, the threat is there that you'll get fired and stop getting paid. And I would say that is coercive. And applying the definition of coercive I stated earlier, it is coercive. But this is where the proportionality element comes in. A certain amount of coercion would be acceptable, because otherwise people wouldn't do things that they didn't feel like doing at the time, and then society would fall apart. You can't have the state be the only ones with any kind of coercive power. So private institutions, companies have to have some coercive power, but when it gets that coercive power is disproportionate and unreasonable, that's normally when an employer will be seen as human trafficking or having their employees as slaves. So normally with a human trafficking organisation, let's say a sandwich shop or a clothes manufacturer has slave workers, normally those workers will have family in their home country who are being blackmailed. So if they run away, their family will get hurt. That's coercion. That's the most clear form of coercion. But also what normally happens is their passports will be confiscated. And when the human trafficking victims have paid off their debts to the company, they'll still have to keep paying them, but they'll be allowed some freedoms. But those freedoms are limited by the fact that the government, or not the government, their owner is still holding or has threats and a lien, if you will, over their family. So that would be an example of when coercion is disproportionate, and English law actually within the human criminal standard for human trafficking does discuss this. In the case law, I won't cite it because I can't remember it, but in terms of human trafficking and modern day slavery, coercion has to be disproportionate and unreasonable. So threatening someone's family, holding their passport, would be enough to make coercion unreasonable. Not allowing someone to have a bank account would also make the coercion for them to work unreasonable and a criminal offence and human trafficking. Whereas if you're a fast food restaurant and your form of coercion is saying to people, if you don't turn up for work on time, you'll be fired, that's not really what anyone would call... Actually, there are people who would say that's unfair coercion, the universal basic income people. But certainly that is not necessarily, at least seen by the law, to be disproportionate coercion. So I think when you hear words like coercion used on the internet, you should also think, what exactly are they on about? Because coercion it varies, and certain types of coercion may be completely justified and legal and even moral, whereas other types of coercion would be completely immoral, completely illegal, and it will depend based on what's being discussed. I was inspired to do this video by the whole Andrew Tate saga because terms like coercion, manipulation, and brainwashing are getting thrown around a lot, and I find it very interesting with saying someone was coerced or saying someone was manipulated, because it's used as a blanket statement, and the way it's used normally is that no kind of coercion or no kind of manipulation is acceptable. And I think that's very intellectually dishonest, because if you're saying someone manipulated you into doing something, okay, I'm quite interested, because if you're manipulated into doing something that you wouldn't normally do, okay, that's an interesting thing to discuss. But how were you manipulated? Because a certain amount of it, a certain time of people, you seem to get some kind of freedom and freedom of choice. I mean, one of the stupidest questions I think there is in philosophy is, do people have free will or not? And it's not a yes or no answer. And it's the same with manipulation, coercion, and brainwashing. It's not black and white. People have free will to an extent, and people don't have free will to an extent. And it's the same for coercion, manipulation, and brainwashing. A certain amount of brainwashing, a certain amount of manipulation, and even a certain amount of coercion will be acceptable and normal. Because when it comes to relationships, and I don't know too much about the Andrew Tate case, and I'm not really going to go into it, but the way it's being used by a lot of people who are not against Andrew Tate or against that worldview seem to have the view that any kind of manipulation in a relationship is wrong, any kind of brainwashing or persuasion is wrong. And this is an issue I really struggle with, because manipulation in especially relationships is inevitable. It's part of your human interaction. People normally interact in a way that is manipulative, and in some cases that manipulation might be extremely bad and extremely unreasonable. Whereas others, manipulation is just a normal part of life. I mean, relationships are hierarchical. Anyone who says they're not is talking out of their backside. You cannot have an equal relationship, because otherwise nothing would get done. That isn't essentially a relationship, because relationships are hierarchical because someone has to make a decision. Someone's word, or what someone says, has to overrule the other, because unless everyone's in complete agreement all the time, which is unlikely, there is a hierarchy there. Because whether the hierarchy is visible or not is neither here nor there, because most relationships have an invisible hierarchy. Each person will normally think they're not in charge or on an equal footing. And I just think it's important to bear in mind that things like manipulation, coercion, and brainwashing, to some extent, are essential parts of human interactions and human existence. Right, thank you very much for watching. If you want to improve your public speaking skills, please check out my public speaking channel, which will be linked in the description, and also feel free to check out my Substack, which is where I discuss legal and political strategy.